Good afternoon and welcome to our Economic Justice Speaker Series. With us today are Paul Kiel and Annie Waldman from ProPublica. They're going to be discussing debt collection and wage garnishment in the black community. This is an article that I've read several times and am both horrified and unsurprised by every time I read it, and the heartbreaking stories contained within and the detailed statistical analysis that's really something that America needs to look at in a much deeper way than we have. For students in our economics classes, there will be a sign-in sheet that goes around. Please sign in to make sure that your professors know you are here. And with that, I'd like to invite up Paul Kiel and Annie Waldman. Thank you.
Hello. I thought I'd just start by kind of more generally talking about what we're talking about, because these collection suits are something that's very common in some communities, but some people don't really come across them. The suits we're talking about are suits over relatively small debts, so credit cards, utility bills, sometimes hospital bills, oftentimes high-cost loans, and they end up going through lower-level courts. So if you want to imagine what it's like in a day of court in one of these places, people tend to assume when you're talking about the court system that you have like lawyers or people up in front of a judge pleading their case. But the way this works is you have usually like a docket call around 9:30 in the morning. There's no judge on the bench. Most of the people who've gotten a summons don't show up, and as a result of not showing up, they're going to get a default judgment against them. Those who do show up kind of sit there and don't really know what to do until typically one of the attorneys that represents one of the plaintiffs, that is, or attorney representing one of the big, banks or debt buying companies, will stand up and say, if you're here, I'm going to call names, and if you're here, then step outside or come forward to this little area and sit down. And that's usually what happens. So people get up and they meet one by one with the attorney for the collections attorney. And the most common outcome of that is they sign a consent judgment, which is, I agree to pay $50 a month or whatever I can afford, and maybe not realizing that by signing the consent judgment, you've given the plaintiff the power to execute the judgment, which means garnishment. So once they get a judgment, and most lawsuits result in a judgment, and the most common outcome is a default judgment, meaning they didn't show up, or they do show up and they sign something consenting to a judgment. Once they have a judgment, that gives them the power to A, go to your employer and get a portion of your paycheck, or B, most common outcome, go to your bank and get the money out of your bank account. And federal law says that they can take no more than 25% of your after-tax pay. That is the law in most states. States do have the option to protect more. In New York, they protect more. So they do also in New Jersey. But federal law says nothing about bank account garnishments, because this was a federal law passed in 1968 at a time when people didn't regularly have their paychecks directly deposited in their bank accounts. But bank account garnishment is a method that collection attorneys use much more now. And so you have a law that says you can take no more than a quarter of a person's paycheck if you go to their employer, but if you put the paycheck in the bank, they can take everything. A couple years ago, there are probably millions of suits each year that are like this. And I say probably because there are no official counts of how many suits there are. So a couple years ago, I started out trying to, put some numbers to this. So one of the first things we did was, this all happens in state courts, relatively low-level state courts. So getting data is difficult, and it's impossible on the national level because there's no one counting, essentially. So we went to the ADP is a payroll company. They process payments for major corporations. And so we convinced them to do a study and look at how prevalent wage garnishment was. And they came back with an estimate that 4 million workers had their wages garnished in 2013 over consumer debt, that the highest rates of garnishment were people earning below the median, so $25,000 to $40,000 a year was the highest rate of garnishments, and blue-collar workers had the highest rates of garnishment of any type of worker, and then they were higher in different areas of the country. So the Midwest had the highest levels of garnishment. So if you're like a worker, a blue-collar worker in the Midwest, about 6% of those workers earning between $25,000 and $40,000 a year had their wages garnished over consumer debt in 2013. And by the way, kind of odd is that the states that do not allow wage garnishment are Texas, the Carolinas, and Pennsylvania. And I'd seen somewhere that Texas, this law goes back to the 19th century, and that was one way to attract people to the West was to make wage garnishment not something. So if you're in New York, you're running away from your debts, you can go to Texas and everything's all right. Another thing, a key thing to keep in mind here is that it's a business decision for a company to go after someone in court. And so typically the lawsuit is happening after there have been other attempts to collect. So they've made phone calls, they've sent letters, they didn't get, what they were looking for, and so then they go to court. It costs money to file a lawsuit, and they want to. The point of it is to collect, right? So when we'll show you the results of this, I think it's important to keep in mind because you don't see the highest rates of this in the poorest neighborhoods because they have to have money for them to take, right? So the highest rates of garnishments are people who are in the income range that there's a lot of financial instability. They're living month to month, but they're not so poor that they're actually protected. There is a floor, like below which you're not allowed to take. Federal, if you're earning more than $200 a week, essentially, they can take a part of your paycheck, and that is obviously like a very low level of poverty. In addition to doing the national study, we also went and got data from the states that allowed us to more granularly look at, which companies are doing this, what industries are doing this, and then also look at different levels in different states. In the ADP study did not look at race, so that was one thing we wanted to do with the data. This study, we took data from 3 different metro areas. So St. Louis, Chicago, and Newark. They're the counties that those cities are in. The reason we picked those 3 cities is, quite honestly, I could get the data from those places because, just it's state to state. Whether they have a statewide system, whether they have adequate data that they could even give us, that was one limitation. And 2, the court data doesn't have race listed for the defendant. So if you're going to look at race, you need to use essentially like where they live as a proxy for race. And looking at St. Louis, Chicago, and St. Louis, those are 3 cities that are fairly segregated. So oftentimes you can, you'll see our analysis is based on neighborhoods, whether the neighborhood had mostly black or mostly white residents. And these are cities that are so segregated that you can, with a high confidence, you can say someone is probably black if they live in this neighborhood or probably white if they live in that neighborhood. So with that, I will let Annie talk about what we actually found in terms of basic numbers.
Hi, I'm Annie Waldman. I'm a journalist at ProPublica as well. I'm also a data journalist, which is something that's a little bit different. I am a programmer. I work in code. I also have a statistical background, so I do most of my analysis in R, which is an open source program that allows me to dive deep into data and see if there's anything in it. There's a lot of interest these days to do more data journalism, and so specifically with this, we wanted to see what was behind the anecdotes that we were hearing, what was behind the story. So Paul already introduced kind of an the data generally. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what we found when we analyzed it once we kind of statistically looked at it and looked at what kind of trends we were seeing. So first, as Paul said, the main thing that we wanted to understand was there an effect, a disparate impact effect? What we were seeing in the Black neighborhoods, it might not have been direct discrimination, and maybe we couldn't actually answer that question, but what we want to see was the effect any way discriminatory? Did it happen in one neighborhood versus another based on attributes such as race or income? And that's really what we were asking. And when you start a data analysis, the most important thing is to have questions. Questions that you might have some sense of how you're going to answer it, but you don't necessarily want to have the answer just yet because that could really taint what you find. So what we did, as Paul said, was that we looked at American cities, 3 of them, which was Newark, St. Louis, and Chicago, and the outlying area of those 3 areas. And we took census tracts, which are statistically broken down areas of land. New York City has lots of them. You probably would never hear of them because nobody uses them. They're not like zip codes, but they're mainly for people who work with census data to understand kind of the breakdown of income breakdown, racial breakdown, ethnicity breakdown, immigration breakdown, things of that nature. So once we looked at census tracts, we chose 50% as our indicator for race. If a census tract had over 50% of the population of one race, we considered that to be a majority census tract. So then what we decided to do was to actually see if we could figure out the risk ratio. If census tracts which were majority Black versus census tracts which were majority white had a greater risk of actually having more judgments. So I'll just pull up some charts so we can start looking at fun stuff.
Did they not give you one of those remotes?
I don't know. It's fine. It's
Okay.
I can be the techie.
Okay.
So I guess one simple way to examine the data was to just simply aggregate it and plot the judgments per capita against the census tract's median income. So as you'll see in this one, this is St. Louis, the average judgments per median income in the St. Louis city and county. And on the left-hand side, if you can't read it, it says judgments per 100 people. And on the bottom, it's the median income. And the blue line is majority white census tracts. The red line up top is majority Black census tracts. So what you see here is just if we're looking at averages and just breaking apart the 2 different types of census tracts, you see that there's a really clear difference. There's something going on in the data that is just, if we wanted to dig deeper into it, this is what we want to look in. Even if you have the equal median income, there's a huge jump in how many judgments are in the majority Black neighborhoods. So, yeah. And then if you look in Cook County as well, you see the exact same thing, a similar trend. However, if you look at the percentage of judgments, it's slightly lower, but Paul will probably mention that later when we talk about some of the attributes of how people garnish wages. And then in Newark, or Essex County, New Jersey, we also found a similar trend. Interestingly enough, there is no data for majority white census tracts beneath the median income 40,000, so we could not compare really less than 40,000. But we still saw similar trends of majority Black census tracts being way above the majority white census tracts. So then we decided maybe we could actually do something a little more complex, which was essentially do regression and also figure out a risk ratio at the same time, which are 2 different statistical techniques, but they essentially told us the same story, which is if you look at the census tracts, and each dot represents a census tract, and the color is the percentage of that census tract that is Black or African American, you'll see that there is actually in the same kind of income bands that the majority Black neighborhoods are way above the majority white neighborhoods. And this trend was consistent throughout all the 3 regions that we looked at. So it led us to actually conclude that there really is a clear clustering of the Black and non-Black census tracts that shows an economic difference, but also a difference in judgment rate. This is Chicago. You see it much more pronounced in Cook County. I mean, to me, there is just a clear clustering of trends that you can't ignore. And then if you move it over to Newark, yeah, you'll see the same thing. Of course, there are fewer census tracts in Newark, so it's a little harder to have a definitive trend, but you see the same thing. And if you see at the bottom, we did calculate a risk ratio. So if we go back to St. Louis, you'll see that for the Black neighborhoods, they're 2.24 twice as high of a risk of judgment, if that makes sense. So if you are a resident living in a black neighborhood or a black census tract, you're twice as likely, essentially, to have a judgment than if somebody is living in a majority white census tract, with, of course, 50% is our defining line for majority. And for Chicago, we found that was 2.09, sorry, so twice as high as well. And for Newark, it was 1.81. So it was substantially lower, but still much higher than in the comparison. So with this data, what do you do with it, right? You can put it, it's one sentence maybe in an article. You can write a white paper, which we did. We attempted to show our results and hopefully have somebody one day reproduce it, because this has really never been looked at, and we hope that it's looked at more by not only ourselves, but other researchers who probably have much higher academic credentials than we do. But one way that we wanted to show people was in an interactive. So I'm not going to talk into the mic for this, so I can just click through it.
Except that then we can't record your voice.
Okay. Do you want to
You can tell me what to do.
just play around with it? So the way that we did this was we created essentially a drop down on the right-hand side where you could explore which neighborhoods were being garnished the most or had the highest rate of judgment. And what we wanted to do was not just show, the map where you can see it's kind of like a heat map where you see the amount of judgments, but then also you can click over and you can see the black population where that stands as well. But we also wanted to actually give you a sense of what was in these neighborhoods. Who was in these neighborhoods? What was the median income? What are these neighborhoods known for? And we wanted to give it for not only St. Louis, where the majority of the story was actually based, but also for Chicago and Newark. So it enabled you to kind of have a greater sense of what was going on in these neighborhoods.
And why the Google map, the Google video thing's not loading? Anyway, for some reason it's not loading here, but one of the neat things about it is there's like a tour of the neighborhood we have. Sometimes it's not, I don't know why it's not loading. But like it basically uses Google Maps images to kind of take you through the neighborhood so you can see like what they look like. I mean, one of the important things I thought to show was that you can see so median household income level there, it's roughly national median. It's a little lower below national median. So you see neighborhoods that are they're middle class neighborhoods, like right in the middle, and yet have these very high judgment rates. And if you go back to St. Louis, so we wanted to, can you go down to Jennings? We wanted to kind of take one neighborhood, I mean, for the story, because we're journalists, we want to tell a story about this data. We wanted to zoom in on one neighborhood, and so we picked Jennings for a number of reasons. One, we thought we wanted to look at St. Louis because St. Louis, for a couple of reasons, is kind of the worst of these three cities that we looked at in terms of what is happening in the courts. Two, you can see the household income in Jennings is $27,000, so that's kind of the peak level of where these judgments are happening. They're happening in communities with incomes around that level, so it's a good neighborhood to look at for that reason as well. Three, Jennings is right next door to Ferguson, as you could see, and I mean, this is something we could talk about in the Q&A, but it's hard to look at this issue and completely separate it from a lot of the other issues that have kind of come to national attention, in part because of what happened in Ferguson and the investigations that have happened there with the municipal court system and that kind of thing. In looking at Jennings, I mean, so you can see here judgments per 100 residents, so 23, and what we should have said is we're looking at court filings over 5-year periods, 2008 to 2012. So over a 5-year period, there was roughly one judgment for every 4 residents. And if you walk around Jennings, and I had like this database of all the different lawsuits that had been in that area, and you would go to a block, and there would be 16 houses, and I could see that there had been a lawsuit against people living at 8 of the houses. And the density is such that in the story, we tell the story of a woman who was sued by a subprime auto place over a loan. She was foreclosed on in 2012. The woman who moved into her home was subsequently sued by the same company. So, you know, this is happening at a lot, is the short version. And another interesting thing is that talking to people, no one knows this is happening a lot. It's the sort of thing that you don't broadcast, as one woman said, like, you don't go on Facebook and say, hey, I got sued, anybody else gets sued? Like, you don't want to talk about it necessarily because, you know, there's a fair amount of shame involved. You sort of feel like you failed personally. And something I kept on hearing is, you know, it's not that these people don't want to pay their expenses. Usually what happens is there's some sort of disruption to income through, you know, your hours are scaled back at work. There's job loss. Oftentimes it's a health issue, so that you have doctor bills, something like that to pay with. So then you have to start ranking your bills. You start falling behind on some. And what happens with this system is, you know, collectors are very sophisticated, and there are a lot of ways to find out whether someone is employed. And if someone's employed, they have something that, you know, they should be able to pay you, is kind of the attitude. You know, the fact that you can't pay now is not a reason not to pay. And if they take you to court, in Missouri and a lot of states, a judgment is good for 10 years. So if you are out of work and that is why you fell behind on your expenses, they take you to court anyway and get a judgment against you. The fact that you can't pay is not a legal defense to a lawsuit. So, I mean, I've been to courts in a lot of different states, and people will say, like, you know, if I explain to the judge, I really do not have the money to pay this, surely the judge will understand. But what they hear is that is not a legal defense. The legal defense is, I do not owe the debt, or they somehow broke the law on how they pursued this debt. And virtually no one has an attorney. One of the outcomes of the data in Missouri is that roughly 8% of defendants had representation, and then in lower income communities, particularly lower income black communities, it goes down to 4%. So basically no one has an attorney. So I've seen court rooms where someone read on the internet that it's illegal to do this or that, and they get in front of a judge and they say that, and the judge is like, do you have a cite? What law are you talking about? And they're like, I don't know, I read it. And then, you know, that doesn't go too well. So let's go to, so yeah, you can go to, so one of the things we do with the data is, so, you know, with this data we have, you know, a line for every lawsuit. So it's millions of lines, every lawsuit have information about who's filing the lawsuit, who's being sued. And we took that data and we wanted to kind of explore if certain types of plaintiffs, you know, were behaving differently, essentially, or who was filing the most lawsuits. St. Louis had the most variety of plaintiffs of these 3 cities that we looked at for a number of reasons that we can talk about. And what you're looking at here is a table. So what we did is we looked at, you know, we were showing you these graphs that are showing how many lawsuits were happening per 100 people. So basically the per capita judgment rate. So this is looking at the per capita judgment rate in lower income black communities versus the low income per judgment rate in mostly white communities. In other words, you know, is there a rate difference in how often they're going to people? And you can see there's a difference, you know, put another way, if you look at utility in the top row there, for middle income communities, they were getting judgments against people in the mostly black communities at a rate 4 times that of the mostly white communities. To generalize, I mean, so talk about important categories of companies that are filing these lawsuits. So down in the middle, you see a category called debt buyers. So debt buyers are companies that really didn't exist 20 years ago. They are large companies, and their business is to buy mostly defaulted credit card debt. So you don't pay your credit card, it gets really behind, 6 months behind. The bank is required to charge that off, meaning they have to recognize the loss in their balance sheet. And there's a market to sell these debts. And these companies will buy those debts for, on average, something like 5 cents on the dollar. So it's a bet that they can collect a certain portion of the accounts. And they go out there, and they've become the industry that uses the courts more than any other industry. So what happens is you fell behind on your Capital One credit card. You fell well behind on it. Capital One called you a lot. They called collection agencies to call you a lot. You didn't pay. Finally, Capital One sold that debt to a debt buyer, and then you'll get a letter from a company you've never heard of. So the biggest debt buyer in the country is called Encore Capital Corp. They collected over $1 billion last year. Their subsidiary that they use is called Midland Funding LLC. So you get a letter from some company called Midland Funding LLC saying that now you owe me $1,500, I owe your debt, which understandably confuses people. And they file lots and lots and lots of lawsuits, to the point that Encore and the other big debt buyer have their own stable of lawyers now, because they figured out we're spending too much time hiring outside guys to sue people for us, so let's get our own lawyers, and there's like it's more affordable that way. So debt buyers file a lot of lawsuits, and one important thing we found, not only in St. Louis but also in Chicago, was that they had a larger racial differentials. In other words, they were filing more lawsuits against people in black communities than white communities at a higher rate than even the major banks. So a major bank is, Capital One, Citi, Bank of America. There's just a few companies that file a lot of lawsuits. Capital One files a lot more lawsuits than other banks, FYI. And then another important thing, so high-cost lender, that means a lender that offers credit at a rate above 36% APR. There are essentially no interest rate caps in Missouri, which basically means anything goes in terms of how much you charge. And there were certain lenders that file a lot of lawsuits like that. When you look at New Jersey has an interest rate cap, and so that sort of stuff is illegal in New Jersey, so you don't see that in the data. Mostly subprime auto places that are charging 25, 30% interest on overpriced used cars, essentially. And those categories, we saw high racial differentials in St. Louis and also Chicago, where there's some of that stuff as well. And then utilities at the top here. So in St. Louis, they have the Metropolitan St. Louis Sewer District, and it's a public utility, and they provide sewer service to the Metro's St. Louis area. So they don't have the power to cut off your sewer service because you didn't pay your bill. And so they, a couple of years ago, decided that they needed to be much more aggressive in collecting as a result of that. They have some upgrades they need to make to their system. But if you own a home, or even if you rent a home in the St. Louis area, you will get like a charge of, on average, it's like $30 for your sewer bill. And what happens is that people who are under financial stress, if they're ranking their bills, which, by the way, is what a credit counselor would tell them to do. You want to rank expenses. You want to pay your mortgage first, your car second, that sort of thing. When they rank the bills, they, of course, put the sewer bill at the end of that list. And so the sewer district decided to get aggressive to the point where the sewer district now files more lawsuits than any other company in St. Louis area. And as you can see, they're near the top of the list. So Christian Hospital is a hospital on the north side of St. Louis County. It's in a very area that is, it's more of a black area. So you can't necessarily look at this and conclude that, medical debt is going to have like a higher racial differential, because you look at the bottom, St. Anthony's Medical Center is a hospital in an area that's very white. So that might just be a reflection of who's living in that community. But the Metropolitan St. Louis Sewer District, they provide service to the entire St. Louis area. Most of their customers are white, and yet they were filing much more of these lawsuits in the mostly black communities. So the obvious question that comes out of that is why that might be the case. And this sort of brings us to just the why of this whole thing. So what we've shown is that at the same income level, you're seeing a lot more of these lawsuits in the mostly black communities, which rules out income as a factor, essentially. But, and I think an important thing to notice and what we found in basically all the cities is that it's a very widespread phenomenon. So one of the reasons we wanted to look at plaintiffs was, is this a result of discrimination by a certain type of plaintiff or a singular company that's filing lots of lawsuits? And it's basically so pervasive that that's not the case, which made us look for kind of larger structural reasons why this was happening. And so that brought us to assets. And when we were sharing our results with academics, that was one kind of refrain, is you need to look at assets. So in the country, the income gap is blacks earn roughly 60% as much as whites. But if you look at wealth, or that is net worth, the gap is much, much larger. It's more than like 13-to-1 at this point in the last national survey, which means that even if you're looking at households in the same income range, this is data that comes from the Survey of Consumer Finances, so it's a national survey done by the Federal Reserve. So we're looking at black and white households in the same income range, and you can see it's roughly like a 5-to-1 or even more than 5-to-1 gap. And this is net worth. This is like, taking into account all your assets, your equity in your home, your car, in addition to whatever you might have in the bank or savings, something like that. On the left is liquid assets, and that's basically like investments, savings, money you can get a hold of pretty quickly. And you can see there's a very large gap there. So these are median numbers. So this is, in other words, so the typical black household has about $650 in ready cash, whereas a white household in that same income range has $2,000. And we're talking about lawsuits that are over relatively small amounts of money. So you can see how if, more than 50% of, or about 50% of black households have in that income range have less money than that in liquid assets, you can understand how a debt of $1,000 or $2,000 can be a problem. And then an additional thing to keep in mind is on the far right, that is showing a response to a survey question about if you needed to borrow $3,000 in a hurry, and could you get that from friends or family? And you can see essentially very poor whites answered yes at about the same rate as middle class blacks. So there's just a big differential there in networks and who you can go to for help when you do have some sort of financial emergency. And probably the last, go to the next one. Yeah. So this is what we think of as a sign of kind of less of a safety net. What we're looking at is the average sizes of these debts that are being pursued in these lawsuits. So what we found essentially is that the lawsuits in the mostly black neighborhoods were over smaller debts than the lawsuits in mostly white neighborhoods. And roughly, so you can see, Essex County, the average lawsuit, middle income, mostly black, $2,600, mostly white, same income range, $3,500. Which to me indicates that the white families, for whatever reason, are better able to deal with these smaller debts. They're less likely to end up in a lawsuit than the black families. Which brings us back to the sewer district, and why would the sewer district have such a large, racial gap in who they're suing? The sewer district is going into court over debts that can be as small as $350, which is very small for these courts. You're seeing average amounts here, even in lower income communities, like $2,600. but they're going to court over just a few $100s, and if that could drive, I think, racial disparities in the fact that if there's less of a safety net with the black families, that they're more likely to end up sued over a smaller amount of money than the smaller amount of money. If you're suing over a lot of small balances, that might give rise to racial disparities in the lawsuits. So I'll just conclude with possible reforms, and then we can go to questions. So I mentioned before the 25% number in terms of how much they can take out of your paycheck. That came out of a bill back in 1968. The reason that bill passed as part of a larger consumer protection bill was that in a lot of states there was no limit whatsoever. So it was legal for them to go to court and then essentially get all of your paycheck. And so they came up, there was a push to somehow limit that. There was resistance to doing that among some senators. And so they go into their room and they come out with this number of 25%, which if you look at national surveys in terms of, families in the band of like $20,000 to $30,000, basically what they're saying is that we spend all of our money on basic necessities. And if you're taking a quarter of their income, you're just setting them up for disaster, essentially. So because of that, some states, have knocked it down to 10%, which is obviously better. And then additionally, there's the bank account issue. There's very little thought get to that. When there are protections, they often, you don't benefit from it automatically. You yourself have to get before a judge and say, I qualify for this or that exemption. You're dealing with people who don't have lawyers or often confused by the process, so that could obviously be improved. I mean, the whole system is set up kind of under the myth that this is something that's going to happen rarely. It's only a way to go after people who are being recalcitrant, are not really do have the assets to pay, and are just refusing to pay, and therefore you should be able to go to court. But it's used in a way that it's a very common way to collect debt, and the people who are caught up in that system are often confused about what's happening, and it probably should be a recognition that this is something that's kind of part of our, our credit system. And then finally, I talked about how bad Missouri is. So in Missouri, they can sue you over a 200% loan, get a judgment against you. The judgment appreciates 200%. So even if you're having your wages garnished, you're having a quarter of your paycheck taken because of this debt, but you're not making enough to cover the interest on your loan, your debt gets larger. So there's a woman, I did a story, she borrowed $1,000 and paid over $5,000 in garnishment. The debt got to $40,000 in size. So it obviously doesn't make any sense. And even talking to lenders, they don't necessarily advocate for that. It's just part of a system that's set up without a lot of thought. So things like that are easy fixes. So I guess now we'll start with questions for me or Annie. Yeah.
What's the solution?
Right. So you can fix what I just described are reforms for the system, right? If you're talking about fixing like the asset gap, that is a larger issue. I mean, one of the academics we interviewed has like a baby bonds idea, which is basically, giving assets to African Americans, which to me you're basically talking about reparations. I mean, I don't know if you read Ta-Nehisi Coates' piece in the Atlantic, Case for Reparations. Like he built it up using examples of public official discrimination, housing discrimination, obviously the biggest one in terms of a lot of policies in the 20th century that fostered wealth in white communities while also preventing blacks from building wealth. So fixing the root cause is a larger problem, but at the very least, if lawmakers would just spend some time and come out with laws that I think the collection industry could live with, that are more sane, then you'd help people. So that's a place to start.
Well, say, you know, this been going on for hundreds of years. This is not, you know, like, you know, it's interesting you say this.
Right.
I was born in Newark.
Yeah.
So, this has been going on, I mean, in the South, you know, we're talking about, you know, taking land.
Mm-hmm.
It's so funny, you know, it's, in other words, I guess what I'm saying, when you say solution, the solution has to be, you know, structure, you know, jobs.
Right.
The solution you're talking about is like a Band-Aid. You know,
Right.
You know, I mean, to be honest with you, that's why I said this has been going on for maybe 200 years.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, when I appreciate what you're doing, but it's,
I understand it's not very satisfying to say, like,
what
you
I'm
know.
saying, what I'm saying, I could come back here 10 years from now and somebody, two of you guys could be talking the same thing 10 years from now.
Well, hopefully be a little different.
No,
at least,
but I'm just saying that could be the case.
Right.
So really, you really have to go to the root. People need jobs, and it's really deeper than that. And the politicians, the white politicians like the Ferguson, they, like you said, they make these policies. And these policies that they make are not discriminatory. For example, in Newark, just briefly, you know, like they do in this community, they say, when black people live here, it's the white politicians who did it.
Mm-hmm.
They're losing because they don't want to have the power. And so, and then of course, then you take the person and get a job. You don't have a job, so you can't pay. So that's, and the bad education. So hey, you add that together, and so you gotta do more than just say 10%.
Okay.
So that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I understand
It
that.
has to be radical.
Mm-hmm. I think she had her hand up first, and then go to you.
Are there any attempts at building advocacy for the people going into court? In other words, it sounds to me as though this is a problem of a lack of financial savvy or a lack of knowledge about the system.
Right.
Does any state provide an advocate for people going into court for these kinds of
I mean, does the state provide? Sometimes they'll have like an information thing where, like, if you are pro se, you can come by and you can get a little information about it, and that obviously could help. In New York, well, first of all, like, New York has better laws. Like, it's 10%. There's some there's programs like kind of attorney for a day type programs where there's an attorney in the court that can help people. That stuff can help. The flip side is that sometimes these lawsuits can be, even if you do have a lawyer, kind of hard to defend against. So for instance, you get sued by the utility in St. Louis and you really did owe the bill, and so there's only so much a lawyer can do, right? But if, I mean, there's a reputation risk for a company suing tens of thousands of people in court, and it's a decision that they make. It's a business decision that they make. So one hope I have, at least the reporting, is that now the utility company knows, it was on the front page of the St. Louis paper today, hopefully that they, you know, if you change the behavior from the plaintiffs, then you can have some reforms that way. Sorry.
Is this also applicable to students who either drop out of school or have debt after school?
So it's student debt is different because basically the federal government is your creditor, but there is garnishment can occur through that, but doesn't go through the local court. What happens is basically the servicer, there's like a process for it. It's like an administrative process, which can also be confusing. It's not 25%, it's 15% of your income, but it's not like you could have one of these, you know, garnishing you in that one, and then I think you can end up with even more of your paycheck gone. So there's, because it's the federal government that's doing it, there's been a lot of pressure for them to get better at how they're collecting and avoiding garnishment. So those numbers have come down a little bit. But yeah, it's something that can happen through that as well. It's a different process. Right. Yeah.
Can you speak up, please?
Oh, sorry. You mentioned that example about a lady who paid off her debt, but she still owed interest, like almost like 30,000.
Right, yeah.
Does that also apply to credit cards? Like,
Yeah, so if I've seen Capital One suing 25% interest rate on your card, but this is a state law thing, right? So I don't know New York law exactly, but I believe this wouldn't happen in New York. But so the debt gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and sometimes they can wait a period of years before they file a lawsuit. So you might have only charged $1,000, but interest has been growing, and you get sued over $4,000 or something like that. And then, so yeah, the debts can get a lot bigger over time. And then I'll go to you. Sorry.
Of course, the debt buyers want to maximize the money they collect,
Mhm.
but if the legislature were to say, like on $1,000 debt, you can never collect more than $20,000, or
Right.
$10,000, who are the forces arrayed against them, and are they that strong to prevent that kind of legislation from going through?
The forces arrayed against the debt buying industry? Or,
Legislators who might want to change the law.
uh,
I mean, because it would be relatively simple to say, you can never, on $1,000 debt, for instance,
Yeah.
you can never collect more than $20,000, since this lady.
right, yeah. No, I mean, it's something that if people focus on it, that there could be very common sense changes. But, I mean, the problem is that there's not a constituency for debtors, really. It's not a popular thing. It was one of the things behind the foreclosure crisis, why the government response was so weak, is because the idea of helping people who didn't pay their bills is not a popular one, even if you think about the fact that they're not paying it because they don't have the money to pay it. I mean, there's a general popular, I mean, you read the comment section in any story I've ever done, these people come out in force, so it's not a popular thing. So
So you can't get the votes for it.
I mean, so there are states where stronger protections have been passed. I mean, they tend to be more Democratic states. Missouri has a Republican legislature right now with a Democratic governor. So I don't know. We'll see if anything happens there. Like, that's the place where, like, the laws appear to me like the most broken. So it'd be easiest to fix, but we'll see if they get anything done. Yeah.
I intend to be a lawyer, and my question was, how does a lawyer see these things? Like,
How do lawyers-
view of a lawyer, and how does it impact his life or her life as a lawyer?
Well, I mean, there's two sides, right? So there's the collection attorney side, which, as an area of law, doesn't strike me as the most interesting. I mean, you're basically pushing paperwork because, you know, you have like a form lawsuit that they have, you put in their name how much they owe, and there have been lawsuits where they get them deposed and ask, like, how much time did you actually spend in this lawsuit? Because they get legal fees when they file these lawsuits. And sometimes it'll be like, depending on the size of the debt, couple $100 even over, you know, and they'll say, like, I spent 4 minutes on this lawsuit or something like that, because they're filing thousands of lawsuits. So the collection attorneys are a big part of the process because they're the ones actually dealing with people if they do show up in court. On the defense side, there is like a small group of consumer defense attorneys. So there's those in private practice, and there's legal aid, which, you know, provides free legal help to people who qualify. Usually they're under 200% of the poverty line, and they can really help people in this situation. So I use an example in the story. There's a woman who got one of these subprime auto loans, and back in 2003, and then the company, like, just kind of sat on the debt and then didn't file a lawsuit until 2013. And the statute of limitations in Missouri is 4 years, so it was out of statute. It was illegal for them to file the lawsuit, but the law is that it's a defense that the defendant has to raise. So she didn't go to court. Even if she had gone to court, she probably wouldn't have known that. But if she had an attorney, then that's a pretty easy defense to a lawsuit. It could have gotten it dismissed. So there are attorneys. I mean, it's the consumer attorneys who are in private practice tend to like to handle debt buyer cases because they bring lawsuits and oftentimes can't really produce proof that that you owe what you say you owe, or because they don't have much documentation behind the debt. So those attorneys will oftentimes file counterclaims and get damages and that kind of stuff. But most people don't have attorneys, so.
I was working for the government. They prefer like.
Well, you don't work for the government, you're working for one of these big companies. You're working for Capital One or one of the big debt buyers for the most part. Okay, you have a question?
I do. In the list of creditors that were seeking wage garnishments,
Yeah.
I didn't see alimony, because it's not coming from a corporation, is that
Right.
correct?
Yeah, it's just handled totally different. Child support is different, yeah.
All right. And then the other one I didn't see was fines and fees. The other big story out of Ferguson and the surrounding suburbs is you've got, all of these ticky-tacky tickets
Right,
with big bills piling up for residents in
Yeah.
these areas.
yeah.
Were those not in the data either?
Well, no, because that's municipal court, so we wanted to look at debt collection of consumer debt, yeah. So, but that is an important thing to keep in mind, is that this is like not the only financial pressure on, these communities. And I mean, one thing I'm curious about is if as a result of the racial wealth gap, black families are less able to deal with smaller debts, you can see why municipal fines would be a big problem. So it's been demonstrated in Ferguson that there was racial disparity in who was even getting these tickets in the first place. And then in terms of who can afford it, you can see why black families would be less able to afford it. And then that spirals into your driver's license gets suspended and then you end up in jail. And so that sort of thing. So, I mean, one woman I interviewed for this, in addition to being garnished over an old auto loan and garnished beyond whatever she owed ever. She had one of these situations where she was arrested for driving without a license as a result of a speeding ticket she didn't handle. And so, there's a lot of financial pressures like that can accumulate. Okay, unless there's any other questions, I think we're.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.